Let's talk plague weapons, disgusting resilience, and the many blessings of Nurgle, with an overview of the Death Guard army in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Death Guard, and I thought with all the updates and the changes that the army has undergone since Nephilim and the Codex came out, it'd be well worth revisiting these diseased marines of Nurgle and seeing what sort of threats they can put on the table. In the video we'll talk over the army's strengths and weaknesses, go over some core rules and some of the strongest aspects of each of the sections within the book, talk over their supplemental rules in the Terminus S strike force and their allies, a quick overview of their datasheets, and finish up with one strong army list. Loads to talk about for Mortarions chosen, so let's jump straight in. So Death Guard have had some ups and downs over 9th edition so far. Started out kind of strong and then became one of the strongest armies in the game on their Codex release. People really found themselves struggling to deal with Mortarion and a lot of the raw tankiness of the Codex when it first dropped. It didn't really last all that long though, as GW dropped other very powerful books like Admech and Drukhari, and then randomly gave the Death Guard a whole bunch of nerfs in the chapter approved later that year, really making them quite bad indeed. Since then though, they gained Armour of Contempt which really helped out the Terminators, and then some really nice points changes which reverted the vast majority of the nerfs back to normal. And it's quite nice to see the army able to compete again. I'd rate them as a fairly solid mid to upper mid tier faction. Can certainly fight solidly against the vast majority of armies in the game and punch up against some of the very toughest things around. In game their win rate is around about 49 or 50% in tournaments currently. They have managed to win a couple of GTs in Nephilim as well, and had a few more high placements besides. Not a bad time to stomp forward and spread Nurgle's blessing. As an army they do have some pretty obvious strengths and weaknesses. On the positive side of things they are very tough, good toughness, good saves, Armour of Contempt and -1 damage, plus other tricks within the Codex. Contagions of Nurgle give them an army-wide toughness debuff to enemies that get close, and plus some other fun effects from their Warlord traits. There's several viable plague companies to build around that can give you different flavours of list. Lots of the datasheets are just really quite strong in their own right, particularly Plague Marines with free war gear, Terminators, Poxwalker chaff and threatening demon engines, plus some solid support HQs such as the Virion characters. All that does come with some downsides though. They are pretty slow and kind of limited for options and movement tricks. They aren't teleporting around the board like Thousand Sons can, for example. They don't really have all that much damage at range besides a few Plague Burst crawlers or Contemptor dreadnoughts, so that is a bit of a weakness as they close in. Even in combat, often their damage output isn't super strong. They do tend to generally want to win the war of attrition as opposed to just blast the opponent off the table. And at least on the defensive profile side of things, mortal wound spam hurts quite a lot. They don't have as great defense against that, and it gets around a lot of their best toughness bonuses. Perhaps can be a little bit reactive and predictable as an army, but it still doesn't mean that they aren't a big threat. Looking at their core rules first, here's a quick overview of rules that apply to quite a lot in the Codex. We've got Disgustingly Resilient, -1 damage pretty much army-wide. It's a really decent damage debuff and is maximally effective against damage 2 weapons, basically cutting their output in half. Can be quite painful to play against Death Guard if you're playing Custodies or Blood Angels for example. Contagions of Nurgle is their army-wide special rule if they don't ally. It's an increasing aura of -1 toughness throughout the game. Usually means that it will always apply in melee, so they'll have a little bit of a damage buff against most foes, and in later turns it's going to be a bit more easy to apply to ranged attacks as well, so could give you a little bit more extra bite out of your bolters and things there. There are the Plague Warlord traits as well, and the Flash Outbreak stratagem, which again is quite a powerful use of the same contagions mechanic and we'll get to later. Since the balanced data slate, there's Armour of Contempt, which worsens AP by -1 against things. It is a really nice extra durability layer on Plague Marines and Terminators, and particularly so in cover. It's pretty crazily tanky when Death Guard Terminators in cover can be saving on AP -3 on a 3+. Otherwise, for common rules within the Codex, we've got Plague Weapons that commonly allow you to reroll wound rolls of 1 and can be amped up in various different ways. Remorseless allows them to ignore combat attrition modifiers, not loads but not nothing either. Occasionally it might prevent a morale casualty. Malicious Volleys, which allows you to rapid fire out to 24 inches if you're either static or in Terminator armour. A little bit more value out of the bolters, though their damage output still isn't exactly outstanding. And that combines quite nicely with Inexorable Advance, which means that you counter stationary for shooting if you didn't fall back or advance, so Plague Marines are usually still going to be able to rapid fire those bolters at 24. On top of that, it also means that infantry ignore movement modifiers, doesn't hurt when you're charging into difficult terrain, and vehicles ignore the heavy weapon penalty when firing in melee. Not absolutely loads, but not nothing either. I guess not too terrible if you have something like a Contemptor or a Leviathan tagged in combat with Chaff. Going through the individual rule sections of the Codex, let's just talk over some of the strongest bits from each section. First up, the Deadly Pathogens are the points cost upgrade for the Codex. They upgrade various different weapons or characters with a little extra ability. Most of their effects aren't super enormous, but a lot are quite usable. Maybe one of the most obvious ones is Viscous Death, just 5 points to reroll shots on a Foul Blight Spawn or a Lord of Virulence. That's usually well worth the points for an increase in damage on their Plague Flame weapons. Otherwise, Unstable Sickness looks like it's a fairly popular one, particularly on Lords of Contagion. Killer model for a 4+ chance to deal an extra mortal wound. A nice buff against hordes, and usually if you're in combat with most infantry, that will often be able to belt you out an extra one if he does get to fight to full effect. Otherwise, for 15 points, maybe a little bit worse value for the point in my opinion, there's Virulent Fever, wound rolls of 6 causing 1 mortal wound, or Explosive Outbreak for exploding 6s to hit for extra hits there. I think both of those are okay, but perhaps just a bit so-so for the points. Moving on, we have Warlord traits. Perhaps out of the table, the two most standout are Revoltingly Resilient and Arch Contaminator. Revoltingly Resilient gives you a 5+ Feel No Pain type save, pretty nice on something like a Lord Contagion or maybe a Demon Prince. Doesn't hurt to add another flat layer of durability to the many that Death Guard already have. And Arch Contaminator is a pretty nice plague weapon buff, turns the reroll 1s into reroll all wounds with plague weapons. Pretty solid in combat with things like the Terminators or the Plague Marines. Perhaps not a bad one to have on a Foul Blight Spawn maybe. Otherwise, for relics, I think really quite a lot of them out of the main codex are relevant. The Plague Skull of Glathilla is perhaps one of the most taken competitively. It's a close-range mortal wound bomb that usually averages something like 4 or 5 mortal wounds on one unit within 6. For 1 CP, that's really quite a massive damage punch. If you do get to throw it at some point in game, that command point is likely to be well worth it. Otherwise, there's the Revolting Stench Vats. That's a Blight Spawn one that allows you to turn off enemy charges within 6 inches. That is in very near auto-include territory if you are taking the Blight Spawn. It just makes him into a really problematic unit to approach and allows Death Guard to get the first strike in melee if you charge in. Tollkeeper is a pretty awesome one for the Tallyman, an aura of exploding 6s to hit at range. Perhaps Death Guard core units aren't known for their ranged attacks, but that's still not terrible on a big squad of Blight Lord Terminators, or even more standout if you're taking a couple of Contemptor Dreadnoughts along maybe. Otherwise, there's the Suppurating Plate, gives a 2+ armor save to something like a Demon Prince, and can bounce a mortal wound, not at all bad with Armor of Contempt in the picture. And the Putrid Periapt can allow a Death Guard Psyker to be a bit more flexible, allowing you to know an extra power. And Fugaris' Helm is quite a nice buff one, giving you a +3 inches to auras, potentially useful on Lords, or even just a few of the Virion members. Perhaps out of these though, I'd maybe consider the Plague Skull and the Stench Vats as a couple of the stronger options. Moving on, the Psychic powers are relatively strong. Just about every single Death Guard competitive list does seem to include a Psyker, and maybe some of the standout picks from that are -1 to hit from Miasma of Pestilence, really nice to throw on something like a ranked up Terminator or Plague Marine squad. You can get +1 strength and toughness with Putrescent Vitality, never bad on a unit that's just about to hit the enemy's lines, and perhaps the best of the mortal wound dealing ones is Curse of the Leper, potentially a decent one if you roll higher than the enemy's toughness. The Death Guard have really quite a lot of stratagems. Some of them are a bit specific to certain units, but some of the more generic ones are these. I think that Flash Outbreak is perhaps one of the most important stratagems in the book. It's a 2 CP one to be able to boost a character's Plague Warlord trait and push it on another unit somewhere else on the board. Potentially you could have it on something that's relatively fast like a featured bloat drone, and then suddenly have an aura of gloaming bloat to turn off enemy rerolls, or perhaps the droning to mess with their movement. Having a big -1 toughness might not hurt as well for any ranged attacks. Otherwise there's 2 CP for +1 to wound, generally handy to have in the bag for when you need it, a 1 or 2 CP to auto-explode a vehicle. Not always relevant, but say if you had a Rhino surrounded by a bunch of enemies and it dies, it could be a pretty crazy amount of damage for a single point. And maybe another useful one for protecting units on objective is Cloud of Flies, 2 CP to make a unit untargetable unless it is the closest. Maybe a little bit niche and expensive, but if it does make the difference between a unit living and dying for an important turn of scoring, it might well be worth the cost. Secondaries wise, these got reworked in the Nephilim update, though as before I still think that Spread the Sickness is by far the best out of them, and I think it's pretty much an auto take in Death Guard lists the vast majority of the time. You have to have an infantry unit with OBSEC, Contamination Objective for an action, and it's quite nice that the action just starts at the end of your movement phase and finishes at the end of your turn. It doesn't even matter whether there's enemies next to the objective or not, you can still use it if you do control it, and then you get 3 VP if the objective's in your deployment zone, or 4 VP if it's outside. Compared with a lot of other action doing ones, this one just seems incredibly easy, and it's quite nice that you can even do it with those very efficient Poxwalker chaff as well, though Plague Marines and Terminators could still pitch in a pinch. Otherwise, I'd say that the other two are alright but not standout. Fleeing Vectors I think is okay if you're playing against hordes with low morale. Really not bad if you are, but that's not going to be the majority of games, and Despoiled Ground is kind of gambling big on you controlling most of the board at the end of the game, which might well happen if you are winning, but I still don't see it as being super standout. Maybe not a terrible one if you are unsure though. Another fairly major decision you can choose is which Plague Company to go for. Each of these gives you access to an extra stratagem, warlord trait and relic. I'd say currently for the strongest options, you're probably looking at either Mortarion's Anvil, the Inexorable or the Ferrymen, or maybe the Harbingers if you wanted to go for the Terminus Est Assault Force, as we'll get onto. I think you could make real arguments for any of those four. Mortarion's Anvil I think is just all around quite strong. They've got a 1 CP heroic intervention stratagem against a charging enemy unit, quite a solid support one that allows little clusters of units to protect each other and be an incredibly intimidating prospect to charge. That only gets worse if there's a blight spawn around as well. Otherwise their warlord trait's really nice in the Gloaming Bloat. That's the one that turns off rerolls nearby, so no rerolls to hit or to wound, really quite a potent debuff. Finally I think their relic is very nice as well, the Warp Insect Hive. 4 rerolls to hit and to wound are rarely going to be a bad thing for any combat units. It's maybe not too bad on a Death Guard Lord of Contagion, though I think it's perhaps stronger on a Demon Prince if you're running one of those. Otherwise, the Inexorable get you a 1 command point, -2 to charge debuff. That could be very nice for tripping up enemies coming out of Deep Strike Reserve, and potentially any other long charges that happen as well. The Ferric Blight Warlord trait I think is another draw as well. That one gives you an aura of extra AP against certain units. I feel like that one's perhaps more relevant than ever in the era of Armour of Contempt. Otherwise, the Ferrymen have some interesting options. A 1 CP option to boost a Virion's aura for a turn, say for example the Foul Blight spawn. Very powerful to have some big effects going off on a wide area and affecting a lot of units. Though I think perhaps the most annoying thing for them is the droning. That's the Plague Warlord trait that allows you a movement debuff, and it could be pretty big if you threw that into the middle of the opponent's army with the Flash Outbreak stratagem. Could certainly stop the enemies getting where they need to go. Otherwise, for the rest, I think the Harbinger's main traits aren't particularly standout. I guess their Poxwalker melee damage buff really is quite scary, and they unlock the Terminus Est Assault Force, which I think is perhaps the main draw. Otherwise, I think that the rest just really aren't anywhere near as competitive. Mortarion's Chosen Sons perhaps are most notable for that Vomitrix Plague Sprayer. Again, the Blight Spawn could be made a bit more dangerous that way. The Poxmongers have a relic to give a vehicle a 4+ invul, which isn't bad, and the Wretched get some psychic buffs, but I really think that these last 3 just don't offer anywhere near as much as the first 3. Speaking of ways to run the army though, you can also choose to run them as the Terminus Est Assault Force. This one's the Harbinger's formation, that means that you have to basically run a Death Guard infantry force. It's perhaps the one to go for if you're thinking about running Poxwalkers in a big way. The rules came in one of those Warzone Charadon books, and as with other armies of renown, it gives you quite a few restrictions. No vehicles, no demon engines, you must be Harbingers, you can't run Mortarion, and Typhus must be the Warlord if he is in the detachment, though you do gain an extra Warlord trait if you do run him here. For benefits of the force, you do get some slightly more expensive strategic reserves. Overall it costs 1 more command point than it would usually, but you get de-restricted deep strike with it, so you could have infantry units popping up all over the board. I guess theoretically quite interesting on Plague Marines or Possessed perhaps. That is quite a lot of CP to be committing early game in Nephilim though. And plus, if you did want deep strike units, you could potentially just do it with Terminators anyway. Next up, you have access to the Festa discipline. I think for the most part it's perhaps not quite as interesting as the standard one, but a couple of spells do stand out. I think my favourite out of them is Rotwind, which allows you to reduce an enemy's unit's attacks by AP2. Basically meaning that with Armour of Contempt in effect, they're going to be doing next to nothing against things like Terminators, and you might make their damage output near useless for a turn if you can cast it. You could back that up maybe with Long Rots to slow down enemies and make their charges a bit harder, and maybe a Pernicious Dose to be role-play weapon hits. That Rotwind one does really seem to be the pick of the discipline though. You could make a very dangerous enemy unit into something rather underwhelming with that. You also get a few stratagems, including a couple of nice ones to buff Poxwalkers, 2 CP for the Rotting Tide, basically resurrects a badly damaged Poxwalker unit and has it walk in from the side of the board. That's not bad. And Unleash the Horde actually gets the Poxwalkers where they need to go, gives them a decent movement buff, and can actually move them forward into threatening positions far faster than their normal movement of 4. You also get a fair few relics in the formation as well, though I don't think that they're really that exciting. Maybe the Filth Sensors is the most interesting for an extra 6-inch range to powers. I guess could have you casting things like Rotwind quite a long way away. Generally speaking, I think the formation is usable but not auto-take. It incentivizes you to make a fairly different Death Guard list, really makes you want to build around maybe 3 or 4 big blocks of Poxwalkers. It does still seem to have a fair few people playing it competitively, but it does seem that most people seem to be choosing to use standard Death Guard lists and leave this at home. So with that quick overview of the army's rules done, let's get into the army roster. Starting out with troops and infantry, the Death Guard have access to 3 different troop slots: Plague Marines, Poxwalkers and Cultists. The Plague Marines became very, very interesting indeed in Nephilim. Basically all of their very fancy gear suddenly became free, and as they're already at least fairly tanky, that means that they're now very dangerous as well, particularly in melee. Plague Marines can take an awful lot of gear between just 5 models. In general, I think that the standout picks to usually arm them with would be the Plague Flail and the Great Plague Cleaver. Both of those can do enormous amounts of damage. The champion should probably take a Power Fist and maybe a Plasma Gun, and then perhaps it's best to add a little bit of ranged threat with Blight Launchers plus maybe Melter Guns or Plasma Guns, which means that the unit can still do something even if it isn't able to make combat for a turn. They're a pretty efficient troops unit. It's quite nice to have them back in a position where you can take multiple squads within an army and not feel too bad about doing so. Death Guard do seem to be one of the armies that are actually incentivized to take more than the minimum requirement of troops choices. Otherwise, Poxwalkers I think are very efficient for what they do as well. 5 points for a decent defensive profile. Really quite nice Obsec infantry chaff for holding down objectives. Can do things like spread the sickness. And it is quite fun that for chaff infantry they can flex into big mortal wound damage output as well. Potentially a big unit could melt enemy elites with something like 5 or 6 mortal wounds on average, and maybe even more if you have CP and your Harbingers. Finally, Cultists are the weakest of the troops right now. Their main advantage is that they can do other actions if you need them to, though in general spread the sickness is a great secondary anyway, and Poxwalkers can do that just fine. Don't really have all that much role in the army currently, while Poxwalkers are so good. Otherwise, for infantry units, we have the Scary Terminators. Again, very, very strong units. I think something around 1 or 3 units seems like a sensible idea for a strong list. The 2 flavours basically depend on whether or not you want more durable or more fighty Terminators. The Blightlord ones are the cheaper, more durable ones. Very, very tough for the points, still pack a reasonable punch in melee, and fire out some combi bolter shots as well. Perhaps their melee threat isn't super high, but they can be a good target for character buffs and things, and just through sheer weight of plague weapon attacks they are going to cause some damage. All the Terminators became Obsec in the balanced data slate as well, which certainly made them a lot handier just for dominating objectives in the midfield. The Death Shroud Terminators cost 10 points more, but basically get loads of melee damage. Those sides really pack a punch with the big damage too, and the Champion's a pretty reasonable place for taking the Reaper of Glorious Entropy Relic, basically a souped up and more dangerous Plague Scythe. They also have a bodyguard rule that can help shield characters a little bit, and I feel like maybe they're one of the best melee threats that you can pair with a Foul Blight Spawn for the Fight's Last ability. Potentially a small unit footprint that you can basically guarantee that the enemy won't be able to strike first against due to the Blight Spawn shenanigans. Otherwise, compared with the Terminators, I don't think that the Possessed and Spawn really compete so much. Possessed are maybe okay for bullying light infantry. They really seem like a far cry from the more scary Possessed in the new Chaos Space Marine Codex. Generally, I just think that Terminators are stronger even with their faster movement. Spawn maybe take that even further, getting more wounds and very little armour, and a slightly faster moving melee chaff infantry. I think they're perhaps most interesting if you just want a really cheap expendable unit to throw on an objective and die. Having the odd individual 1 or 2 doesn't seem the worst idea, just for an annoying unit to force the opponent to deal with. I wouldn't really expect them to do all that much heavy lifting though. Vehicles next, and perhaps king of the demon engines is the Plague Burst Crawler. Weirdly a unit that starts out with really quite a good damaged and defensive profile, and then has got successive points buffs over the course of the edition, even if they did make its mortar a bit worse against things out of line of sight with the barrage nerf. Plague Burst Crawlers are really tough for the cost, pretty decent damage output with the mortar plus the entropy cannons for a bit of anti-tank, and they also have that fairly good disgusting force stratagem that can allow you to splash a few mortal wounds around if you target a big unit. A pretty solid investment, and something that doesn't feel too bad to have sitting around on a home field objective while delivering a bit of firepower. I think featured bloat drones are very usable as well, one of the faster units in the Death Guard Codex, which is always handy to have. I think the Flesh Mower is by far the best, giving you very good melee damage, and it can be handy for the Flash Outbreak stratagem. They also do have a 1 CP stratagem to heroic intervene on objectives and things, which could make them quite a good unit to park on a midfield objective and dare the opponent to get close. Mephitic Blight Haulers I think are okay, but maybe a little behind the first two. With their missile launchers and their multi-melters, they have okay anti-tank damage. They are a bit cheaper now, but I think for their raw damage and defense, they just still don't outcompete the very good Plague Burst Crawler, which really has cast them into shadow for as long as it's existed. Maybe one of their biggest selling points is their stratagem to reduce the number of shots. Occasionally that could cut the amount of firepower they're taking in half if they do get shot by lots of 2-shot weapons. Another option for really solid long-range firepower is the Chaos Contemptor Dreadnought from the Imperial Armor Compendium. They're a little bit more painful to take in Nephilim as they do cost a CP beyond their points cost, but they are pretty much the best source of firepower with core in the Death Guard army, packing a whole punch of Volkite shots or las cannons, plus a missile launcher on the top usually, and seem to be great hanging out with a Tallyman for exploding 6s to hit. Still could be good, but in Nephilim it's going to be a bit more painful to take more than one. For transports, there's the Rhino, which seems like a very solid option for transporting Death Guard Plague Marines around the board. Now their melee and damage is actually genuinely good, plus they are quite tough. Getting them where they need to go can actually be worth paying the premium, though I still think that foot slogging is pretty viable. The Dreadclaw Drop Pod is another potential option. Again, that could get Plague Marines where they need to be. Possibly could be worth the premium to throw them down on an objective turn 1 and maybe get to work spreading some sickness or firing out a bit of Blight Launcher fire. Otherwise, I feel like the rest of the vehicles are a bit underwhelming compared with the top options I've already mentioned. Land Raiders just do the transport thing with a bit too much investment compared with the Rhino. They aren't even enormously tough in the Death Guard Codex compared with all the competition. And again, you're paying for a lot of guns that you might just get locked up in the enemy if it moves forward. The Hellbrute's another okay source of core firepower, probably best with missile launchers and las cannons and perhaps making use of Fire Fever. Predators just really don't compete with Plague Burst Crawlers, and Defilers, again, I think you'd be better off with either Plague Burst Crawlers or Featured Bloat Drones. They just feel a bit more efficient than them. Finally, there's the Miasmic Malignifier in the Fortification slot. Fairly tough and provides some okay utility. Getting light cover could be quite good if you know that you will be able to set it up on a midfield objective and being able to protect a unit that's going to be relevant. Still though, doesn't seem to be taken in top lists all that often. Out of the vehicles, I feel like the Plague Burst Crawler, Bloat Drone, and the Rhinos are maybe some of the most relevant things, and the Blight Haulers, Chaos Contemptors, and Dreadclaws all seem usable as well. Lastly, for the units, we have the characters. The Death Guard do have a fairly extensive roster of these guys: Lords, Psykers, a Demon Prince, Virion characters, and Mortarion himself. First up, there's quite a few options for Lords of the Death Guard. I feel like out of these, maybe the raw might of the Lord of Contagion makes him the default pick. A reroll aura, some boosted range on his contagion abilities, plus a fairly meaty stat line both in damage and defense. I think he's probably the strongest overall, but I think that the Lord of Virulence is also usable. Trades a bit of melee damage for some ranged shots with his Plague Flamer. Viscous Death could be a pretty reasonable upgrade for that if you're not using it on a Blight Spawn. And I think Typhus is also very reasonable to include over the Lord of Contagion, provided you wanted more psychic powers, and you didn't necessarily want to pick any given Warlord trait or relic on him, as of course he is locked to just one Warlord trait. Otherwise, I don't think that the other Lords are really quite as strong. Maybe the standard one could be okay if you just want some cheap rerolls, though I'm not sure that's the most efficient use of the character slot. Then, as you can't take more than one Lord in a detachment, usually you want to fill out a battalion, so that would leave you either with a Psyker choice or a Demon Prince. Out of the Psykers, I feel like the Malignant Plague Caster is the better one. The Terminator Sorcerer isn't bad and does have some extra durability, but the Plague Caster being cheaper and also spitting out extra mortal wounds I think usually makes him more worth it. Otherwise, you've got the choice of a Demon Prince, a fair bit more expensive, but again quite a decent generalist, can be somewhat fast with the wings, can provide rerolls and caster power, and is perhaps one of the best places if you want Warlord traits or relics that buff melee or durability, things like that 5+ Feel No Pain, or maybe the Warp Insect Hive from Mortarion's Anvil with the full rerolls. I'd say perhaps the default pick would be a Lord of Contagion plus Malignant Plaguecaster in the Death Guard HQ section, though the Demon Prince, Typhus and the Lord of Virulence all have their perks. Otherwise, in the Elite section we have the Defeated Virion. A lot of these are really quite good little buffing characters for their cost, particularly the top three. The Foul Blightspawn is much feared as the breaker of charges on many games. He has a Fight's Last aura within 3 inches, and with the Stench Vats he gets the charge debuff out to 6 inches, basically meaning that he can defend Death Guard units from being able to be hit first in combat, and making things like Death Shroud Terminators almost essentially unchargeable, unless your unit can just tank some pretty massive damage before they even get to strike. Plus he's got fairly solid damage himself with his Plague Sprayer that he could take Viscous Death on, so it can both be a damage threat and a big charge deterrent. The Tallyman I think is also very efficient, 70 points to farm up some command points, give you +1 to hit on a unit, and potentially take that Tollkeeper relic for exploding 6s to hit at range. All of those are great things. As support characters go, he's very good indeed. And the other one that I think is really solid is the Biologus Putrefier. His command phase buff gives you a big boost to melee damage output on Terminators or Plague Marines. 6s to wound cause a mortal wound, and with Death Guard squads potentially being really quite big, that could stack up to quite a lot of damage right there. Plus you can do some grenade things as well, though I think that the mortal wound thing is my favourite benefit for him. Otherwise, I think that the Noxious Blightbringer and the Plague Surgeon just aren't quite as good right now. The Blightbringer gives you a little bit more movement and morale boost, and the Plague Surgeon does give you a bit more durability. On paper really quite a good thing for an already tough army, but in general people seem to get more value out of the others, and there's only so many that you really want to take, as you don't want to take too much away from battle line units. I think he is usable though with some big stacked up Terminator units. Finally we have Mortarion himself, really quite a big cost at 450 points, an enormous chunk of the army, but to be fair he does do quite a lot. He's very hard to kill with his toughness 8, invuls, feel no pain and -1 damage. He's got massive melee damage, gives out 4 rerolls to a core unit, has a large contagion range that can give -1 toughness and maybe the gloaming bloatout, and multiple warlord traits including Arch Contaminator. At the points cost I certainly think is usable, though I still think he's potentially a bit of a challenge to really justify his big points cost in game. Even if he does kill a few units, he might still fall short of just how many points he's cost you. On top of that, against some armies, they might not actually have all that much trouble in removing him from the board just with massive damage in 9th edition, and if he does go down a bit early, losing that many points could be a pretty major setback. Finally, before we take a look at an army list, a quick word on allies. Generally in 9th edition, they're just not the best idea. In Death Guard, you lose your Contagions of Nurgle, which are quite a nice debuff, plus the secondaries such as Spread the Sickness, and that's rarely going to be a good idea in Nephilim when there aren't all that many book ones to choose from. However, with the latest Chaos Codexes, there are a couple of options that don't break the rules. Chaos Demons allow you to field up to 25% of the power level of your force in Demon allies. You would have to pay the command points for the extra detachment though. Out of Demon detachments, I feel like Nurglings might be the biggest draw. They're fairly tough and give you forward deployment options, though you would have to take some Plague Bearers along as they can't fill mandatory troop slots. Otherwise, I guess maybe Beasts of Nurgle could be kind of annoying little objective grabbers. They have that regeneration rule where they ping back to full health if you don't fully kill them, making them almost impossible for small squads to deal with without concentrated firepower. Otherwise, I think that Chaos Knight Dreadblades definitely have a fair amount of interest. I think on paper War Dogs seem the best. Fast-moving Auspex certainly won't hurt a Death Guard army that tends to be a bit more slow and purposeful. I feel that either the combat or the shooty versions can be useful. Brigands and Executioners could give you some solid firepower which the Death Guard army isn't overflowing with, and Stalkers on Carnivores could just bring you some raw melee might. Otherwise you could maybe take a big knight. I guess in theory something like a Knight Tyrant could really solve anti-vehicle issues for you quite well, though I must admit with their datasheet and synergies they're not super overwhelming. I guess one advantage of these guys though is that as you don't break Contagions of Nurgle, they might be able to attack things with -1 toughness when they wouldn't normally be able to. Could be okay if they do manage to go down a meaningful bracket. Overall, I think that these maybe just be a little bit borderline worth it with the CP cost, but could be another interesting way to run Death Guard with a different flavour. Finally, to bring a few things together, I thought we might just take a quick look at one competitive Death Guard army list, one that's done well at a recent tournament. This list was run by Derek Apshey, who used it to take first at the Goonhammer US Open, and the list has Mortarion in it, backed up by a plate company of the Inexorable. They're the ones with the stratagem for a -2 to charge, and also the Ferric Blight, which is in effect in the Lord of Contagion. It is quite cool to see the newer, cheaper Mortarion doing well and helping win a tournament. In this one he does take his Warlord traits for the extra toughness, Curse of the Leper for some mortal wounds, and Gift of Contagion to debuff a unit. Then otherwise, in the HQ section of the battalion, there's a Lord of Contagion with Plague Reaper. They take the Ferric Blight for the extra AP -1 against certain units, the Plague Skull of Glothilla for the big mortal wound bomb, and Unstable Sickness, the one that allows you to get extra mortal wounds when you kill something. Having the Ferric Blight and Glowing Bloat in play means that you could have either of them pop up as the flash outbreak. I'd imagine Glowing Bloat could be a bit more helpful, but getting an extra boost of AP on some scary melee wouldn't hurt either. Then there's a Plague Caster taking Miasma, Putrescent Vitality, and Curse of the Leper. They've got the Putrid Periapts to allow the extra choice of power, and a Barebones Tallyman for the command point farming and making one unit +1 to hit. Then for the actual battle line of the army, there's a unit of 10 Plague Marines, 2 each of the Cleavers, Flails, Maces, and Melter Guns, 1 with the Icon, and then a champion with a Demon Blade, Plasma Pistol, and Power Fist. They'd be a pretty potent little melee force, and look like they'd be riding either in the Rhinos or the Dreadclaw drop pod. There's then 2 smaller units of Plague Marines, again taking Cleaver, Flail, and Mace, each for the big melee damage, 1 Melter Gun, and again the Power Fist. And again, I guess they'd be filling out some of the transports. There's then 2 units of 10 Poxwalkers, presumably for actions and objectives. They could do a bit of spreading some sickness. And then a unit of Deathshroud Terminators, with the champion taking the extra gauntlet for a bit of raw melee might. Potentially, I believe that if you wanted a forward strike force, they could actually deploy it in the Dreadclaw drop pod along with the Lord of Contagion. That could allow them to get in a pretty threatening position right from turn 1. Otherwise, there's a couple of Demon Engines to round up the list, a Plague Burst Crawler with Entropy Cannons and the Slugger, a bit of firepower plus that disgusting force stratagem if you want it, a Bloat Drone with the Grizzly Flesh Mower, fast-moving anti-infantry melee, and a good source to use that Flash Outbreak stratagem on, and then as mentioned the 2 Chaos Rhinos and a Dreadclaw drop pod. Really quite a cool list to see some fairly mechanised Death Guard there, and nice to see Mortarion on the board at the top of a tournament as well. Always cool to have a Primarch doing well. Certainly seems like a solid example of a lot of the stronger choices that the Death Guard can bring to the table, and the Plague Marine melee looks pretty vicious indeed. So I think we'll leave that there for our look at Death Guard then, so I hope a rundown of a few of the options and strongest things has been a bit helpful. I feel like they're in a fairly good place in 40k at the moment, definitely not one of the weaker armies by any stretch of the imagination, though definitely have their weaknesses with slightly low movement and damage. As always with these, if you do have any other tips or tricks that haven't been mentioned in the video, please let other Death Guard generals know down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'm sure we'll have more stuff for the Sons of Mortarion in time. Finally, if you have been finding the videos on the channel useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's how I can keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. Big faction reviews like this do take an enormous amount of time and effort to make, so if you have been enjoying a lot and would like to help to keep them coming, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.